All right, let's go. Number 10, the body problem. In 2025, geneticists at Princeton University finished mapping 250,000 years of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. What they found should have been front-page news on every newspaper on the planet. Neanderthals didn't lose the evolutionary race. They were absorbed into it. Their DNA is not a fossil. It is active, right now, inside your body. Between 1 and 4% of the genome of every non-African person alive today is Neanderthal. Their genes are shaping your immune response, your skin, your metabolism, your risk of developing autoimmune disease. They are not an extinct species in some museum diorama behind glass. They are part of you. But here's the thing that almost nobody considers. What if the absorption had never been completed? What if Neanderthal populations had held on, maintained their numbers, kept breeding as a distinct species alongside Homo sapiens for another 40,000 years? What would your city look like? What would your government look like? What would the word human even mean? Because the deeper you dig into what Neanderthals actually were, based on the latest evidence from paleogenomics laboratories in Princeton and Stanford and the Max Planck Institute and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the more you realize that sharing this planet with a second intelligent human species would have changed everything. And some of these implications are far more unsettling than you would expect. The first problem is the most obvious, and almost nobody talks about it. Neanderthals were not a slightly different version of us. They were a fundamentally different physical machine. Their bodies were built for an Ice Age planet. The average male stood around 165 centimeters and weighed 78 kilograms. Females averaged 155 centimeters and 66 kilograms. Shorter than most modern Homo sapiens, but packed with a density of muscle and bone that our species simply does not carry. Their body mass index would classify them as overweight by every modern medical chart, but there was almost no fat involved. It was raw structural mass. Barrel-shaped rib cages wider than ours at every measurement. Hands built broader, with a grip that could almost certainly overpower any modern human athlete. Limbs shortened relative to the torso, an adaptation that minimized heat loss across glacial European winters. A gene called LEPR, responsible for fat storage and internal heat generation, that researchers have compared directly to the same gene found in woolly mammoths. These were people engineered by 300,000 years of natural selection to survive on a frozen continent. And that engineering creates an immediate practical crisis in any scenario where they coexist with modern civilization. Because every airplane seat, every door frame, every piece of standardized clothing, every hospital bed, every set of body armor was designed for one human body plan. Theirs does not fit. Their caloric demands alone, estimated at 500 to 5,000 calories per day, just to maintain that muscle mass in a cold climate, would require fundamentally different agricultural systems, different food supply chains, different nutritional science. The infrastructure of modern civilization was constructed on the silent assumption that human bodies come in one basic shape. A surviving Neanderthal population would have shattered that assumption before the first stone was laid in the first city wall. But the deeper implication is not about logistics, it is about perception. We would have grown up, from the very first generation, in a world where the word human referred to two visually distinct body types walking the same streets. Two silhouettes. Two sets of proportions. Two answers to the question of what a person looks like. The psychological architecture of every society on Earth would have been built on a wider foundation than anything our single-species world has ever known. Number 9. Two kinds of intelligence. In 2025, a research team led by Ralph Holloway at Columbia University published findings that overturned a century of assumptions about the Neanderthal brain. They compared brain shape differences between Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens against the normal range of variation that exists among living humans today. The result was unambiguous. The differences between the two species fell within the range of variation already present between modern human populations. The brain differences between Neanderthals and our direct ancestors were no larger than the brain differences between two groups of living people, and nobody treats modern human brain shape variation as evidence of cognitive inferiority. The older model told a simpler story. A 2018 study had reconstructed Neanderthal cranial shape and concluded they likely had smaller cerebellums, the brain region associated with cognitive flexibility, language processing, and working memory. That finding was cited for years to argue that Neanderthals were mentally limited compared to sapiens. But the 2025 reanalysis from Colombia exposed a critical flaw. The original study never asked whether those species-level differences were actually larger than the differences between living human groups. When that comparison was finally performed, the answer was no. This matters enormously because the archaeological record does not support the cognitively inferior narrative. In 2018, a landmark study published in Science used uranium-thorium dating to establish that cave paintings in 3 Spanish caves were at least 800 years old. That is a full 20,000 years before Homo sapiens even arrived in Europe. In Croatia, Neanderthals harvested eagle talons and fashioned them into necklaces. In southern France, deep inside Roanoke Cave, they constructed semicircular walls from broken stalagmites 176,000 years ago, in complete darkness, 336 meters from the cave entrance, for reasons that nobody has been able to explain. A world with surviving Neanderthals would have confronted us with something profoundly uncomfortable from the very start. Intelligence is not a single dimension. It never was. Their brains may have excelled at spatial reasoning, visual processing, and hands-on physical problem-solving in ways that ours did not. Ours may have been optimized for abstract symbolic manipulation and large-scale social coordination. 2 species, 2 cognitive architectures, 2 different ways of being smart, coexisting on the same planet. The concept of a single test measuring a single dimension of intelligence would have been impossible to maintain. Number 8. The language barrier that never closes. Neanderthals carry the FOXP2 gene, the same gene linked to speech and language capacity in modern humans. Their hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped structure in the throat that supports the tongue and enables complex vocalization, was virtually identical to ours in shape and function. The complexity of their social lives, their coordinated group hunting strategies, their documented care for severely injured individuals who survived long after debilitating wounds, all of it points to a species that communicated with sophistication. But their vocal tracts were structurally different. Their skulls were longer and lower than ours. Their nasal cavities were substantially larger, built specifically to warm and humidify cold, dry air before it reached the lungs. The acoustic properties of a Neanderthal voice would have been unlike anything you have ever heard. Deeper, more nasal, with a fundamentally different resonance. Not inferior. Alien. In April 2026, the first published research from Tin Shemet Cave in central Israel changed how scientists understand the relationship between the 2 species entirely. The study, published in Nature Human Behavior, revealed that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens in the Levantine region around 110,000 years ago did not merely coexist in proximity. They actively shared technologies, lifestyles, and burial customs. Cultural exchange at that depth requires communication, not necessarily identical language systems, but overlapping networks of meaning complex enough to transmit tool-making techniques and ritual practices between species. If Neanderthals had survived into the modern era, the concept of a universal human language family would never have existed. 2 species with 2 independently evolved communication systems, potentially structured around fundamentally incompatible grammars. Imagine trying to build a nation where a significant portion of the population processes syntax and metaphor through entirely different neural pathways, where the concept of what a sentence even is might differ at a biological level. Translation between sapiens languages is already imperfect across thousands of years of shared cognitive architecture. Translation across a species boundary would be something closer to permanent approximation, a barrier that technology could narrow but never fully close. Number 7. The disease exchange. In 2019, evolutionary biologist Gilly Greenbaum at Stanford University proposed a model that reframed the entire Neanderthal extinction question. Published in Nature Communications, his mathematical analysis suggested that Neanderthals may not have been eliminated by climate shifts or direct competition at all. They may have been killed by our diseases. When 2 populations that evolved in complete isolation for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly begin sharing the same living spaces, they exchange pathogens. Each population carries diseases their immune systems have adapted to handle, but which the other has never encountered. This is precisely what happened when Europeans arrived in the Americas. Smallpox, measles, and influenza killed an estimated 90% of indigenous populations across 2 continents. Not because their immune systems were weaker, because they had never been exposed. Greenbaum's model showed that complex disease transmission patterns could explain both why Homo sapiens eventually displaced Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, and also, perhaps more puzzling, why the replacement took over 100,000 years to complete. The diseases needed time to build asymmetric lethality between the 2 populations. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed that Neanderthal DNA fragments in our genomes today directly influence immune function. A study led by geneticist David Reich at Harvard Medical School identified Neanderthal gene variants associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, Crohn's disease, lupus, and biliary cirrhosis. Other inherited variants influence skin and hair characteristics, including keratin production that may have helped early sapiens adapt to colder Eurasian climates. A coexisting world would have been a world of permanent epidemiological negotiation. 2 species, 2 immune histories, sharing subway cars and office buildings and hospital waiting rooms. Diseases that present as a mild cold for one population could be catastrophic for the other. Public health infrastructure would have had to be designed from the foundation to accommodate 2 fundamentally different biological responses to the same pathogens. Every pandemic in human history would have unfolded along an additional fault line. And the question of who gets vaccinated first, with which formula, optimized for whose immune architecture, would carry a weight that our single-species world has never had to bear. Number 6. The genetics of coexistence. In July 2025, researchers at Princeton University published what may be the most comprehensive genetic timeline of human-Neanderthal interaction ever assembled. Their analysis mapped nearly 250,000 years of interbreeding between the 2 species. The conclusion overturned the simple narrative of replacement and extinction. Modern humans and Neanderthals did not just cross paths occasionally. They repeatedly interbred, shared genes, and merged populations across 250,000 years. The genetic data reveals an asymmetry that carries disturbing implications. At the time of the last Neanderthals, roughly 10% of gene flow was moving from Neanderthals into sapiens populations. Almost none was flowing the other direction. One interpretation is that fertile hybrid offspring were being absorbed into sapiens communities, but not surviving or reproducing within Neanderthal groups. Over extended timescales, this one-directional genetic absorption would have steadily expanded the sapiens gene pool, while shrinking the already sparse Neanderthal one. Some researchers have proposed that Neanderthals did not go extinct in the traditional sense at all. They were genetically diluted, absorbed into our lineage generation by generation until the distinct Neanderthal genome ceased to exist as a separate, identifiable entity. If that absorption had never completed, if Neanderthal populations had maintained the size and connectivity needed to sustain themselves independently, you would have a world with a spectrum of genetic identity. Pure sapiens ancestry at one end, pure Neanderthal at the other, and a vast, complicated gradient of hybrid populations stretching across every continent between them. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the biology. It is what humans do with biological categories. We have a documented, millennia-long history of constructing social hierarchies based on physical appearance. Adding a second species to that equation does not produce automatic harmony. It introduces a new axis of otherness that no civil rights framework in recorded history was ever designed to address. The question of who qualifies as human would not be philosophical. It would be legal, economic, and violently contested. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. I cover prehistoric science and deep dives like this every week. Number 5. The social network gap. In February 2026, anthropologist Ariane Burke at the Université de Montréal published a study in Quaternary Science Reviews that offered a fundamentally new explanation for why Neanderthals disappeared while sapiens survived the same environmental pressures. The answer was not intelligence, it was not technology, it was not even climate, it was network topology. Burke adapted species distribution models from conservation biology and applied them to the archaeological record of both species across prehistoric Europe. She mapped where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lived, then analyzed how well connected those habitable zones were to each other across warming and cooling climate cycles during marine isotope stage 3, roughly 60,000 to 34,000 years ago. The results were striking. Regions favorable to Homo sapiens were significantly more interconnected than regions used by Neanderthals. Sapiens populations could move between allied groups across connected corridors of habitable land when local conditions deteriorated. Their social networks functioned as safety nets, allowing groups to exchange information about animal migrations, form partnerships, and temporarily access other territories during environmental crises. Neanderthal groups maintained connections too. Archaeological evidence of material exchange across regions confirms they were not completely isolated. But the models showed those links were more fragile and more regionally limited, particularly across Central and Eastern Europe. When climate variability accelerated, sapiens groups had fallback positions within reach. Neanderthal groups were increasingly stranded in habitat islands that could not sustain them through prolonged instability. In a survival scenario where Neanderthals persisted into the present, their societies might have remained structurally different at a fundamental level. Smaller communities, tighter kinship bonds, less long-distance trade, less cultural exchange between geographically distant groups. In a globalized modern economy, where economic survival depends on vast interconnected supply chains and information networks, a population whose deep social instinct tilts towards smaller, more self-contained units would face a structural disadvantage. Not because of inferior capability, because of architectural mismatch with a world built by and for the hyperconnected species. Number 4. The art question. In the Spanish cave of La Pasiega, there is a red ladder-shaped symbol painted on a limestone wall deep underground. Uranium-thorium dating of the carbonate crust that formed over the paint, conducted by Dirk Hoffman at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, established a minimum age of 64,800 years. The study was published in Science in 2018. Those paintings were made at least 20,000 years before any Homo sapiens set foot in Europe. Neanderthals painted that symbol, in pitch darkness, deep inside a cave system, having prepared both a light source and red ochre pigment before descending. The locations were deliberately chosen, positioned beneath low overhangs and on impressive stalagmite formations. These were meaningful symbols placed in meaningful spaces. At the Cueva de Ardales in Malaga, southern Spain, researchers confirmed in 2021 that the pigments used on the speleothem walls did not come from natural mineral outcrops inside the cave. They were transported from outside. And variations in the chemical composition of the paint correspond to different time periods, meaning Neanderthals returned to the same symbolic locations and added new markings over spans of thousands of years. The cave was not decorated once. It was maintained as a symbolic site across generations. In Gibraltar, Neanderthals engraved a hashtag-like symbol into bedrock. In Croatia, they harvested eagle talons and strung them into what appear to be necklaces. In Italy, they hunted birds specifically for their feathers, possibly to wear as ceremonial decoration. In Bruniquel Cave in France, they broke stalagmites from the cave floor and arranged them into semicircular walls, 176,000 years ago, 336 meters from the entrance, in absolute darkness. A world where Neanderthals survived would have produced two independent artistic traditions evolving in parallel across tens of thousands of years. Rooted in different perceptual systems, different relationships with the physical environment, different symbolic vocabularies that emerged from different cognitive architectures. Neanderthal art might not look like sapiens art. It might not function like sapiens art. It might prioritize spatial placement, material texture, or environmental interaction over two-dimensional visual representation. The Western art canon, which already struggles to accommodate non-European aesthetic traditions within its own species, would face a category it was never constructed to contain: art produced by another kind of human mind. Not primitive, not derivative, simply organized around principles that sapiens' critical frameworks might never fully decode. Number 3. The rights crisis. Every legal system on Earth rests on a single unstated assumption: there is one species that holds rights, Homo sapiens. The entire architecture of human rights law, from the Magna Carta signed at Runnymede in 1215 to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted at the Palais de Chaillot in Paris in 1948, assumes that the category of human is biologically self-evident. One species, one set of rights-bearing moral agents, no boundary cases. Surviving Neanderthals would have shattered that assumption before recorded history ever began. Because the archaeological evidence is not ambiguous about what kind of beings they were. At Shanidar Cave, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, excavators recovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal male who had survived for years after losing the use of his entire right arm and suffering severe damage to his left eye socket. He could not have hunted, he could not have defended himself. He was fed, sheltered, and protected by his group over a prolonged period, at cost to their own survival resources. They buried their dead with deliberation. They made jewelry from eagle talons. They ground mineral pigments and may have decorated their bodies with ochre. They constructed geometrically arranged stalagmite formations in the deepest parts of caves that no survival instinct would have led them to enter. If a being buries its dead, decorates its body, creates symbols in places of deliberate significance, and cares for its disabled members at personal cost, does it have rights? If it can suffer, communicate, conceive of the symbolic, and choose to protect its vulnerable, does it qualify for legal personhood? In our actual history, we fought wars across centuries to extend the concept of rights to members of our own species who looked slightly different from those writing the laws. The idea that rights might need to cross a species boundary, not as an extension of animal welfare, but as a recognition of equivalent moral standing, would have been the defining legal and philosophical crisis of every civilization that ever existed. Every constitution would need a second clause, every treaty would need a second signatory species, and the history of what happened when those clauses were violated would be among the darkest chapters ever written. Number 2. The Extinction Mirror. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years. They endured glacial periods that buried the continent under kilometers of ice. They survived the aftermath of supervolcanic eruptions that darkened skies across hemispheres. They adapted to climate oscillations that reshaped ecosystems on continental scales, and they did it with population sizes that would terrify any modern conservation biologist. Estimates suggest the total Neanderthal population across all of Eurasia never exceeded 70,000 individuals. They lived in groups averaging between 5 and 15 people. By modern ecological standards, they were a critically endangered species for most of their existence, and they made it work, for longer than Homo sapiens has existed as a distinct species. Then something shifted. The climate became more variable. The oscillations between cold and warm came faster and less predictably. And a new species arrived from Africa, one with larger social networks, higher population density, and a fundamentally different strategy for surviving uncertainty. Within roughly 5,000 years, the Neanderthals were gone. A study published from the University of Copenhagen in September 2024 reinforced the demographic reality. Neanderthal genomes sequenced from late surviving populations showed deep inbreeding. These were groups that had been isolated and small for many generations, accumulating harmful genetic mutations with no influx of new diversity to compensate. Their genetic resilience was already collapsing before Homo sapiens arrived in force. If Neanderthals had survived into the present, they would have served as a permanent, living reminder of something our species prefers not to contemplate. That species' end. Not because they were stupid, weak, or inferior to whatever replaced them. Because the specific conditions that sustained their way of life shifted faster than their particular set of adaptations could compensate for. They would have been the embodiment of evolutionary fragility, walking our streets, sharing our public spaces, reminding us with their presence that 300,000 years of proven resilience can be unmade in a few millennia by shifts in climate and connectivity. We are doing to thousands of species right now exactly what the late Pleistocene did to the Neanderthals. The only difference is that we can see it happening and they could not. Number 1. The identity collapse. Every belief system humanity has ever constructed, every religion, every philosophy, every political ideology, rests on the same hidden structural foundation. We are the only ones. The only species that thinks abstractly. The only species that creates art. The only species that buries its dead and wonders what comes after. The entire framework of human meaning assumes, at its deepest level, that there is one kind of mind capable of asking questions about existence, ours. Surviving Neanderthals would have demolished that assumption before the first temple was built in the Fertile Crescent. Because if another species also buries its dead with care, also paints symbols in caves it enters only for ritual purposes, also fashions decorative objects from the talons of birds it hunted specifically for that material, and also protects its disabled members at cost to the group's survival, then the claim that consciousness and moral significance and the capacity for meaning belong uniquely to Homo sapiens becomes indefensible. You cannot observe a being that maintains symbolic sites across thousands of years and constructed geometric stalagmite arrangements in total darkness 176,000 years ago, and sustain the position that yours is the only mind that matters. The consequences would have reshaped every domain of human thought. Theology would need to account for two ensouled species, or construct a framework explaining why one possesses a soul and the other does not. Ethics would need to negotiate between two moral communities whose instincts, social architectures, and possibly even baseline conceptions of fairness were shaped by different evolutionary pressures. Philosophy of mind would never have been permitted to rest on the comfortable default that human consciousness is the sole example of consciousness worth examining. And beneath all of it, the deepest fracture, we carry their DNA. 1 to 4% of every non-African person alive today is part Neanderthal. The boundary between us and them was never clean. It was always a gradient, a 250,000-year-long spectrum of interbreeding and genetic exchange that our categories of species and identity were never built to accommodate. If they had survived, there would be no pretending otherwise, no clean lines, no pure lineages, just a continuous distribution of human identity stretching across two species and 250,000 years of shared genetic history. The question that should sit with you is not whether we could have coexisted. The fossil record from the Levant to Iberia suggests we did, for tens of thousands of years. The question is what it reveals about us that we ended up alone. Because in a universe where another kind of human mind was possible, where another way of being intelligent and creative and social actually existed on this planet, we are the species that remains. Not because we were better, because we were more connected, more numerous, more relentless in our expansion. And somewhere, in a cave in southern Spain, 800 years ago, a Neanderthal painted a red ladder on a limestone wall in the dark. We will never know what it meant. We will never know what they would have become. We inherited their world, their genes, and their silence. And the silence is the part we should be paying attention to. Before you go, one question. Of everything in this video, which theory changed how you think about what it means to be human? Drop it in the comments. I rate every single one. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.